March 15, 1623, in the hours before dawn, when Istanbul lay wrapped in silence and the Bosphorus reflected nothing but starlight, a scream tore through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace. It was not the cry of a servant or the wail of a woman in childbirth. It was the voice of Princess Fatima Sultan, 15 years old, daughter of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. And according to whispers that would haunt the palace for generations, it was a sound that made even the hardened eunuch guards turn away in shame. This was not a scream born of physical pain alone. It was something far worse, the breaking of a spirit, the shattering of a soul that had been systematically dismantled in the weeks leading up to this moment. And if the rumors that slithered through the servants' quarters held even a fragment of truth, Fatima Sultan was not the first imperial daughter to suffer this fate, nor would she be the last. The Ottoman Empire, that vast machine of conquest and glory that ruled 3 continents for over 600 years, built its power on iron discipline and calculated strategy. From 1299 until its final collapse in 1922, it commanded armies that shook the walls of Vienna and fleets that turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the world itself seemed to tilt on its axis. Byzantium vanished into legend, and in its place rose a new power, one that would reshape the very fabric of civilization. At the heart of this empire stood Topkapi Palace, a sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens, throne rooms and treasure vaults, where sultans plotted campaigns and viziers whispered secrets that could topple kingdoms. But within those same walls existed another world entirely, one hidden behind lattice screens and guarded doors. The imperial harem, home to hundreds of women, operated under rules so rigid that a single misstep could mean exile or death. And it was here in this golden cage that the daughters of sultans learned a terrible truth, that their royal blood was not a blessing but a curse, one that would bind them to a destiny darker than any dungeon. Born in 1606, Fatima Sultan entered the world as the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and Kaksem Sultan, a woman whose name would become synonymous with power and intrigue. Kaksem was no ordinary consort. She was a force of nature who would dominate Ottoman politics for decades, feared by grand viziers and respected by janissaries. Under her mother's watchful eye, young Fatima flourished. She mastered Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Turkish before her 12th birthday. She studied astronomy with palace scholars, debated Islamic jurisprudence with theologians, and wrote poetry that court musicians set to haunting melodies. Chroniclers who witnessed her brilliance called her a jewel of the dynasty, a mind as sharp as Damascus steel wrapped in silk and grace. But in the Ottoman court, intelligence offered no protection, beauty brought no mercy, and royal blood, that supposed mark of divine favor, was in truth the heaviest chain of all. From the moment Fatima drew her first breath, her fate had been decided by men who would never ask her opinion, never consider her dreams, never acknowledge that beneath the title of princess beat the heart of a human being. She was a tool of statecraft, a bargaining chip to be played when the empire required it, and when the time came, she would be handed over to a man she had never chosen, to seal an alliance she had never wanted, in a ceremony that would be celebrated as glorious even as it destroyed her. The man selected for her was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a battle-hardened commander 20 years her senior, a warrior whose loyalty to the throne needed reinforcing and whose ambition required satisfying. For him, marriage to a sultan's daughter meant elevation, prestige, a pathway to greater influence. For Fatima, it meant the end of everything she had been, and the beginning of a nightmare that official chronicles would never dare record. Not even Kaksem Sultan, that master manipulator who had bent the empire to her will, could shield her daughter from what was coming, because this was not merely a marriage. According to the whispers that have survived in fragments of memoirs and coded passages in forgotten texts, this was something far more sinister, a ritual of submission so carefully designed that it would break a girl's spirit long before her wedding night ever arrived. And if you think you know where this story is going, if you believe you understand the depths of what these imperial daughters endured, then stay with us, because the truth is far darker than you imagine. If stories like this one, histories that have been buried beneath centuries of silence, are what bring you here, then subscribe now, because there are shadows in every palace and ghosts behind every crown, and we are just beginning to call them into the light. The preparation, they called it Turbi Vivi Mubarak, sacred instruction. But those who witnessed it described something closer to systematic destruction. In the 7 weeks before her wedding, Fatima Sultan was moved to the Helvak KK, the bridal pavilion, a beautiful prison where every moment of her existence fell under absolute control. An elderly attendant named Gulna Hatun, whose face bore the scars of decades in palace service, became her constant shadow. The training began with posture and gesture, how to bow at precisely the correct angle, how to lower her eyes without appearing defiant, how to walk with hands folded in permanent supplication. But it went far deeper than etiquette. Fatima's vocabulary was deliberately restricted. She was taught specific phrases of gratitude, apology, and acceptance, while any word suggesting autonomy or desire was struck from her permitted speech. She repeated these phrases hundreds of times daily, until the rhythms of submission became more natural than her own thoughts. Any error brought punishment, days of fasting, Hours locked in reflection cells where darkness and silence pressed against her mind like physical weight. But the whispers speak of something even more disturbing. Rehearsals conducted in underground chambers where Venetian craftsmen had constructed disturbingly realistic wax figures. If the accounts are to be believed, and many historians remain skeptical, Fatima was forced to practice the physical mechanics of her wedding night with these grotesque mannequins while attendants watched and corrected her like tutors reviewing a student's grammar. Every gesture was recorded in ledgers, every sign of resistance noted and punished. Whether this specific claim is fact or the embellishment of later storytellers hungry for scandal, what cannot be denied is that Fatima's final months of freedom were marked by systematic humiliation. Palace records confirm that she was required to serve her father's concubines, women who had once been slaves themselves but now ranked above a princess in the bizarre hierarchy of the harem. She dressed them, bathed them, prepared them for their nights with the Sultan. Witnesses recalled seeing her weep as she fastened their veils, tears streaming down her face while the concubines laughed or ignored her entirely, each moment designed to crush whatever pride remained in her royal heart. Her diet, too, became a weapon of control. She was fed pomegranates and honey, goat's milk and almonds, but also strange elixirs prepared by court physicians, mixtures that some claimed contained extracts of poppy and valerian, substances meant to induce calm and compliance. Her baths were no longer refreshing but ritual immersions in waters perfumed with oils said to prepare her body for her husband's touch, every drop a reminder that she no longer belonged to herself. The walls of her chambers were hung with tapestries depicting obedient wives celebrated for their fertility and submission. Silent lessons she could not escape even in sleep. Mirrors were positioned so that she could never avoid her own reflection, a Sufi practice of self-observation twisted into psychological torture, forcing her to watch her own transformation from brilliant young woman into hollow vessel of duty. And then came the wedding day itself, March 15, 1623, when all Istanbul erupted in celebration, the streets filled with processions and music, war drums and stringed instruments creating a symphony that seemed to shake the very stones of the ancient city. In the palace, banquets stretched for hours, Persian dancers and Andalusian musicians entertaining guests while the janissaries demonstrated their martial skills and poets composed verses praising the union. For the people it was a spectacle of imperial glory. For Fatima it was the countdown to her execution. Palace physicians noted troubling signs that day. She drank almost nothing despite the spring heat, her lips cracking and her hands trembling uncontrollably. She sweated through her undergarments and stared at nothing, her eyes empty of recognition when spoken to. Today we would call these panic attacks, the body's desperate attempt to flee a threat it cannot escape. Then, they recorded it as virginal melancholy and did nothing to stop what was coming. When the feasts finally ended and the last guests departed, Fatima was led to the bridal pavilion, an octagonal structure in the palace gardens that had been prepared for this night. She was bathed again in rose water and sandalwood, her body anointed with oils, dressed in white silk so heavy with pearls and gold embroidery that she could barely move beneath its weight. Some said the gown itself was designed as a kind of restraint, its layers and weight forcing her body into stillness, making resistance physically impossible. And then she was brought to the chamber where Kara Mustafa Pasha waited, the walls hung with tapestries of military victories, a reminder that this union was conquest as much as marriage, that her body was territory to be claimed in the name of empire. What happened in that room? The official chronicles do not say. They record only that the marriage was consummated and that the union was blessed. But the fragments that survive in private memoirs and servants' gossip paint a different picture. They speak of attendants stationed outside the door, listening to ensure the act was completed. They describe Fatima's voice, already weakened by weeks of conditioning, falling to barely a whisper. Some accounts, possibly exaggerated by time and repetition, claim she fainted multiple times, that there was bleeding the physicians coded as the soul departing the body, that her mind retreated so far inward that she seemed to stop being present at all, her consciousness fleeing to some unreachable place where the horror could not follow. Whether every detail is accurate or some elements have been darkened by the imagination of later writers, the essential truth cannot be denied. The girl who entered that chamber was not the same person who left it. Something fundamental had been broken, something that would never heal. In the days and weeks that followed, the transformation became impossible to hide. Court physicians recorded symptoms we would now recognize as severe. Trauma, muteness broken only by sudden crying, violent recoil at the presence of men, even trusted eunuchs, complete loss of appetite and a haunted expression that never left her eyes. They tried remedies, herbal infusions and music, Sufi meditation and prayer, but nothing restored what had been taken. The young woman who had debated astronomy with scholars and played melodies that made grown men weep never touched an instrument again. Her books gathered dust. Her laughter, once famous throughout the palace, was never heard again. The marriage continued because it had to, because empires do not acknowledge their crimes, because admitting the truth would crack the foundation of the entire system. Children were born, ceremonies were held, appearances were maintained, but in private, silence ruled absolutely. Later writings suggest that even Kara Mustafa Pasha, that hardened warrior, found himself unable to face what his wedding night had created, retreating into military campaigns and opium, anything to avoid the ghost of the girl he had helped destroy. Fatima lived for 29 more years, appearing at state functions as a silent figure in silk and jewels, fulfilling her role as dutiful wife and mother while dying slowly inside. And on the anniversary of her wedding in 1652, palace doctors recorded her death from brain fever, though whispers insisted the date was too perfect to be coincidence, that her body had finally surrendered on the very day her spirit had been killed decades before. Her story, buried beneath official histories and celebrations of imperial glory, survives only in fragments and rumors, in the coded warnings mothers whispered to daughters, in the careful silences of court chroniclers who knew that some truths were too dangerous to record. But Fatima Sultan was not alone. In the margins of forgotten documents, other names appear and vanish. Princesses who died young of unnamed illnesses, who disappeared from registers after marriage, who were described in euphemisms that barely concealed tragedy. Some historians believe they can trace patterns of suicide and madness among imperial daughters, though the evidence is carefully obscured. A few accounts speak of secret embroidery codes, of desperate pleas for divorce, even of princesses who faked their own deaths to escape second marriages, whether fully accurate or colored by imagination. These fragments reveal a truth the empire never wanted acknowledged, that the women who carried its bloodline often paid a price more terrible than any soldier on any battlefield. So here is the question that will not be silenced. How many other stories like Fatima's remain locked in sealed archives, hidden behind the golden myths of sultans and empires? How many princesses and how many palaces, Ottoman and European, Chinese and Russian, lived and died in silence, their suffering transformed into fairy tales of romance and destiny? If this story has unsettled you, if you feel the weight of these forgotten voices pressing against your conscience, then leave a comment below and tell us which queen or princess you believe deserves to have her real story told. Because only by tearing away the silk and shattering the myths can we finally hear the voices of those who were sacrificed to power, and maybe, just maybe, ensure that their suffering is never forgotten again.